So when we first started trying to come up with classes for World of Warcraft, we looked at a lot of different sources, but primarily what we were looking at was kind of traditional role-playing game classes, and then the other big thing we looked at, of course, was Warcraft 3. The first thing we did was we had to determine which classes we were really going to use. So one of the first approaches was another philosophy that we use at Blizzard a lot, which is called concentrated coolness. You know, rather than just having, let's say, a class and we just kind of throw a bunch of random stuff on it, we want kind of everything about the class to feel focused and to make sense within the context of that class. But we also wanted to make sure that there was a separation of roles between every class. Something we didn't want to do was have just a few classes and then have a bunch of hybrid classes that fit in between. Obviously, some classes ended up on the cutting room floor, and a couple of those classes we mentioned up here is the Necromancer was a popular unit in Warcraft 3. Obviously makes sense as a class. Didn't quite make it in. The Death Knight was another example of a very popular hero type in Warcraft 3 that didn't make it. So the origination of the mage came obviously from kind of traditional role-playing games, and it also came out of a couple units that we had in Warcraft 3, the Sorceress and the Archmage. So you can see some of the abilities on the mage really kind of look a little bit like the Warcraft 3 heroes. You know, in particular, you know, an emphasis on fire magic and frost magic. You know, we really wanted to really kind of keep that same vibe and coolness with from the Warcraft 3 element. One of the major spells that never really came over, though, for example, was the Summon Water Elemental spell, and that's because what we wanted to see out of the mage was not really a pet class. You know, we wanted to reserve that for other classes, and we felt like if we did that with the mage, it would actually kind of water down how the mage would play in a massively multiplayer game. And one of the spells that he had early in development was called Chains of Ice, which brings us to our crowd control philosophy with classes. So when Chains of Ice was on the mage, the way that it worked was that you could actually cast it on any enemy monster, and that monster would stay in place. And you can cast it on any number of monsters. And what we found out very early on was all you had to do was take a mage to any dungeon, and you only had to fight one monster at a time, because the mage could cast Chains of Ice on all the rest of the monsters, and if you had a 6-pull, an 8-pull, whatever it was, the mage could lock them all down except for the one. And what we really wanted to achieve was to make sure that all the classes that had crowd control had very limited crowd control. We wanted to try to get everyone involved in the crowd control if possible. We didn't want to have like one class that really changed the entire game. So here's a comedic interlude about the mage. Thank you, Penny Arcade. I hope you guys have all gone by their booth. So just out of curiosity, how many people in the audience play Horde? And how many play Alliance? I think from yesterday we probably should have learned our lesson and actually separated the crowd, but the origination of the Paladin came pretty much straight from Warcraft 3, which was a little bit unique in that it's a very defensive class. You know, historically, if you look at traditional RPGs, you know, it's very much a hybrid warrior-priest class, and while our Paladin certainly had that, we really wanted him to concentrate on defense. We wanted the Paladin to be one of the easier classes to play. It was actually intentional, and the main reason was we found that the Paladin was a very attractive class for people to want to play initially because they felt like it was supposed to be a hybrid class, and hybrid classes tend to be easier to play and easier to solo in other massively multiplayer games. So we kind of took that to heart, and we really wanted to make sure that anyone that played the Paladin would kind of have an easier time. Now, there is a kind of a negative aspect that would come up with doing that, which is the Paladin, probably out of all of our classes, has the least amount of button mashing to do in combat. So that's something that we're continuing to look at and continuing to try to address. We want to try to make sure that the Paladin continues to be fairly easy to play, but we do want to make him a little more interactive over time. The Priest was probably a little more of a unique concept in our game than you might have seen in other traditional role-playing games. A lot of, I think, other RPGs have the idea of a cleric, which is a much more armored sort of priest class, and we wanted our priest to again separate itself a little bit from other RPGs, and that's how also we portrayed the priest in Warcraft 3, which is much more of a caster class. A lot of people, when they first started playing the priest, were surprised to see that they're wearing cloth robes and such. But that also allowed us to make the priest a little more interesting on the damage side. You can see, like, if you spec much more as a shadow priest, or even without being a shadow priest, our priest has a lot more damage potential than you might see with more of the traditional cleric. And then we came up with the idea of racial specific spells, which, you know, we decided to do with the priest, obviously, and you can see kind of each race of priests has a couple special spells they're able to do. And we thought that worked out pretty well, and we're looking at maybe expanding on that a lot more in the expansion set. The shaman, again, kind of originated from Warcraft 3. It came out of a combination of the orc caster units, the witch doctor, the shaman, and the farseer. One of the things, though, we did have to struggle with quite a bit early on was the portrayal of shamans in the Warcraft lore. In the Warcraft storyline, shamans are really portrayed much more as warriors, not as kind of the Native American medicine men or kind of what you might traditionally think of shamans. But the shamans that fight for the orcs, you know, they carry shields and swords, and they can stand up next to grunts or any warrior within the army. So that created a little bit of a problem within, you know, of course, trying to create some, you know, balanced classes within the game and wanting to stand different from the warrior but not be as powerful. So we kind of tried to make our shaman a little bit more of a mage fighter with the emphasis kind of mage first and fighter second. Initially, the shaman didn't have totems, and, you know, he wasn't a particularly interesting class when you compared him to, let's say, the mage or any other caster class. So that's where the idea for kind of incorporating some of the witch doctor elements came in. So we tried a few different a few totem approaches with the shaman. One approach was that every single totem spell could be cast separately. So that ended up with a whole lot of totem spam. You would end up with like 8 to 10 totems in every single combat, and you're just leaving them everywhere. And you might end up with 2 or 3 shamans in the group in a dungeon fight, and suddenly you got just these sticks poking all over the dungeon, and that was no good. So we said, okay, well, let's change that up. And we tried for a little bit of time, okay, well maybe it's enough if he just has 1 totem. And that was really too far the other direction, since now it just felt like he had 1 spell gimmick, and, you know, that was no fun. So eventually we came up with the idea of, well, what if we kind of make totems around the elemental schools? The shaman, anyways, is already kind of in lore about the elements. So it ended up being kind of the right approach. It gave us the right mix between the two, and it also really felt correct within the lore. The warrior, probably more than some of the other classes we've talked about, came more from the traditional RPG side. You know, we obviously have a lot of warrior-type units within the RTS game, but there really wasn't one unit we looked at and said, okay, well, that's the World of Warcraft warrior. We found very early on that it wasn't a particularly interesting class because you would just kind of wait for all your abilities to be up on their cooldown, and you know, you're kind of just punching a metronome. You know, you'd wait for the taunt ability to come up and then press that. You'd wait for the strike ability to come up and then press that. And there really weren't a lot of choices to make, since there really was no reason not to punch those abilities every time they came up. So we looked at, you know, kind of other genres for help. And, you know, what other genre to look at for a warrior than, let's say, fighting games, which are all about, you know, combat. So that's where we came up with the idea for the Rage Bar, which you kind of see some different ideas of that in fighting games. So the Hunter was another interesting class to develop. The Hunter originated in Warcraft 3 with the Headhunter, the Ranger, and the Huntress were all kind of classes or units that we looked to kind of develop the Hunter class. And in beta, the Hunter had a completely different way of playing than he does in live. He had something called a Focus Bar, which worked a little bit like the, you know, it's like a Rage Bar or an Energy Bar, but instead it was a Focus Bar. And the way Focus worked was whenever you stood still, it would actually increase the amount of focus, and then you would get a certain amount of focus and then be able to use abilities. And we played with that for a long time, and we really liked the fact that it made him very unique. And it just ended up not being particularly fun, especially in a game where, you know, there's so much movement in PvP or even sometimes in PvE. You know, even though it was a different concept and it was very unique, ultimately it ended up being less fun. So in the Hunter's case, we actually chose to go with more traditional mana bar and rely on his ranged combat and pets to really differentiate him from the other classes. But a lot of what we want to do with the Hunter, to not only just be a pet class in the sense like a Warlock, but we wanted you to care about your pet, which is why we put in all the notions of loyalty and the idea of pets having a diet. We really wanted you to kind of be invested with what pet you had. And the reason it's so, you know, it takes a little bit of time to actually develop out a pet is because we wanted you to have that connection with the pet. And that was kind of the main differentiation between like Hunter pets and Warlock pets. The Rogue is one of our few classes that actually doesn't really have a Warcraft 3 equivalent. Like I guess the closest thing you might look at is in Frozen Throne, the Warden or something like that, but we really don't have a true rogue class in Warcraft 3. So the rogue definitely came much more kind of from the traditional RPG approach. So originally we called the rogue the assassin. That was the first origination of the class. And the assassin kind of sounds cooler, but ends up being a very narrow class when we started developing what he could do. Ended up being just about killing, and we wanted the rogue to really bring a lot more to the table than just kind of what the assassin sounded like he could do. The rogue was another class that really, if you look at other games that have done rogues, a lot of times they're very similar to kind of what I was talking about with my pet peeve with the warrior was. You ended up with a very monotonous sort of class that you just waited for cooldowns and used that. And the rogue in particular, we wanted to be a much more frenetic class to play. So we came up with the idea of the energy bar along with the combo system. And what we were trying to accomplish there was we wanted a combo system that was a little bit more free-form than you might see in other games. We didn't want to force you into combat chains where you had to use opening move A and then B and then C. We instead went to a much more open-ended approach where we had the idea of setup moves and finishing moves. And we've really tried hard to try to allow you a lot of freedom in what combinations you want to use. So the Warlock was one of the first classes we actually worked on. It was a class that I was pretty excited to work on initially, and the Warlock doesn't really have a class, from a traditional RPG or from the Warcraft 3 game that we're looking at. We're more looking at the Warcraft lore of Warlocks. Warlocks, and back when the orcs were part of the demonic horde portion where they were bloodlusted, they had warlocks in their lore, and they were, some of the more powerful sorcerers. So we thought that'd be a pretty neat class, and we also thought it'd be really interesting for the warlocks to be on the alliance side, so it'd kind of give, even among the more kind of good or friendly races, kind of a more evil class to play. So the warlocks obviously are all about fire and shadow magic, and that goes back to the demonic roots that I'm talking about with the orcs. Initially, we definitely wanted to do a pet class with the warlock, but we weren't sure exactly how we wanted the pets to work. We've seen other games where there'd be like a pet progression. You would get, let's say an initial pet, and then 10 levels later you get a better pet and never use the first pet again. So we really wanted to make sure that if we're going to put in all these really cool pets like imps and succubuses and what have you, we didn't want you to get to the maximum level and then you never see them again. You only see the top level pet. One approach we tried was the idea of every single warlock pet would be this extremely powerful sort of pet, and you would just bring them out for that fight, and then the next fight you use a different pet. So you might, in this fight, use the succubus because the succubus was really high damage or had crowd control, and the fight would end, and now the succubus might be on a 15-minute cooldown, so the next fight you'd be kind of forced to use, let's say, the infernal, and then he'd now be on a cooldown, so you'd be cycling these different pets. But ended up having a couple problems. One problem was that people wouldn't necessarily like cycling that. They kind of wanted to pick a pet for a particular fight and be able to stick with that. The other problem that really ended up was that combats could really last any variable length of time. You might see a fight last for 2 minutes, you might see a fight last for 6 minutes. And if the pet only lasted for 5 minutes, it really sucked for the group if the succubus suddenly disappeared. So that's where we eventually ended up with the approach we have now, which is kind of an interesting variety of different pets. And just like we developed the classes, we try to develop the pets kind of with their own role and their own purpose for being. The other interesting thing about the Warlock came the notion of the pet bar. So you have a lot of control over not only what behaviors your pets did, but also whether or not they cast spells or not, or whether or not you wanted them to cast auto-cast spells, which is a concept we brought over from Warcraft 3, or do that yourself. So the Druid came from Warcraft 3 again, and it was we kind of made our Druid as a combination of all the different Druids in Warcraft 3. The Druid of the Claw, the Druid of the Talon, and the Keeper of the Grove were all of our kind of Druidic magic units in Warcraft 3. Because the Druid was really introduced only in Warcraft 3, and it really had this very strong storyline to why they existed and why only the Night Elves had them. And we really struggled for a long time about whether or not, how true we wanted to stay to that lore. And like our creative director at first really was insistent that only Night Elf males could be Druids. Because that's the way we portrayed the Night Elves in Warcraft 3. All the females were the fighters. They're the ones that, kind of wore the pants in the Night Elf family. The males stayed at home and wore the robes and, talked Druidic magic. So that was kind of our concept for the Night Elves. And when we kind of went forward into World of Warcraft, we struggled with that for a little while. And initially the Druid hit the cutting room floor. And then as we talked about the other classes and we talked about what would be a cool class, we kept on coming back to the Druid and going, the Druid would be really unique. So one of the things we can always do at Blizzard is change our story. And then we got the Druid into the game. We really didn't want to have, just like one or two classes and then a whole bunch of hybrid classes that bridge the gap between the two, going back to kind of what I was talking about originally, we want every kind of class to stand on its own 2 feet. But at the same time, we knew that a lot of people really enjoyed kind of that being able to dabble in a whole bunch of different classes. So we figured the Druid would be our great opportunity to do that. And the vehicle that allowed us to do that was the whole concept of shape-shifting. Our Druid, everything we do in Warcraft, we try to separate a little bit from what may have been done before. So we wanted our Druid, rather than just kind of be a staff-wielding, robe-wearing tree hugger, we wanted to be a shapeshifter. Kind of that concept of, take that Druidic concept over here and then take the idea of werewolves over here and put them together. And that was really what we ended up with our Druid, and it gave us that great vehicle to make it a hybrid class.
So as we were developing the character classes in WoW, we were kind of slowly but surely coming to the realization that we really needed more ability for characters of a given class to differentiate themselves from other players of the same class. So at first it was simple stat customization. And we've got a screenshot here that kind of shows how that worked. At the time, very early on, all you could do is just select a stat when you leveled up and put some points into it. A lot of players would tend to kind of go into the cookie cutter builds, and it still didn't feel like there was a lot of customization there. So next we moved on to another system that was definitely more developed. And as you can see here, there's still the ability to have the stat point expenditures. Then we also added some other abilities like blocking mastery, defense mastery, dodge mastery. There were also some others below that, like fire damage increase, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those modifiers that you see there were flat amounts, such as increases your agility by 3, which meant that as your character kept leveling up, it felt like spending talent points earlier on really hadn't impacted your character very much. So at that point, we really realized that, okay, we need to do a lot more with the talent system we've done before. We'd also tried doing more with the secondary skill system, but we realized, well, because that's sort of the realm of the professions, we don't necessarily want the professions competing directly against attributes that you might be using to enhance your character's combat power. So some of the key concepts that we looked to for further evolving the talent system were we took some inspiration from Diablo 2. Some other core concepts were that we wanted a limited pool of points. We've heard a lot of suggestions over time because players have a natural tendency to want to continue to develop their characters almost indefinitely, that, hey, why don't you, as you keep gaining experience beyond the level cap, maybe that'll eventually contribute to gaining more talent points or something like that. But we actually felt that that waters down the core philosophy of having a limited pool of points so that you would actually have that as your character customization system. So this is kind of from the mindset of knowing what we wanted at this point. We want passive abilities, we want active abilities. How are we going to get there? How does it all work out? So we started with this UI mock-up here, which sort of has a motif of actually going left to right, where you would have tier 1 talents, for example, and you would purchase talents in tier 1, and once you got all the talents in that tier, it would automatically open up the Uber talent at the end of that tier. The problem there is we didn't feel like the actual UI implementation was as clear as we wanted, and we also didn't feel like it left a lot of choices for the player. It felt like, well, it really only leaves the choice of, in this case, Fire, Frost, and Arcane. So here was another method that we talked about going with. You'd be able to select pretty much any talent there, assuming you had the points required to spend it, and you'd be able to spend multiple points in the talent, kind of like you can today. Now, the problem with this one, it didn't feel very visual. It didn't feel like it jumped out at you as to what it meant, like, and how it related to the exceptional talents that were down below. The ones that you see at the very bottom section, exceptional talents, would kind of be the 1-point talents that you automatically get if you spent enough points in the tree. In trying to go with something a little bit more visual, we went on to the next evolution. You have a set of talents that have prerequisites. There's a definite path that you can kind of see how you might work your way down the tree. Talents potentially would have multiple prerequisites. We thought this would actually be a pretty interesting way to go. This was really kind of the screenshot where we decided, you know what, I think we're on the right path. And I think we can, go ahead and take this and refine it a little bit more and turn it into something that's actually really usable in the end. We started to realize as we did a little bit more design work in that previous one that we were going a little too far with the prerequisites. Not only should the prerequisites not necessarily completely constrain the player in terms of what choices they're able to make, but we also wanted to make sure that there were a lot of different paths to get down the tree. If you have too many prerequisites, it really cramps your ability to get down the tree in different ways. Some of the things that make our class balance a considerable challenge are that we have a lot of different types of gameplay. In addition, we have issues where sometimes our approach to a character class doesn't necessarily match the vision of what was intended for that character class. We've certainly seen this to some degree in the Paladin case. We always kind of imagined the Paladin class as being the holy warrior, where you would get in there with the warriors and you had your plate armor on so you could take the damage and you would be beating on the mob. And yes, you would be a healer in a backup situation, but that's not really how it's kind of played out over time because healing's such a strong mechanic. So we're always faced with these difficult choices when we see that, okay, well, something's really evolved kind of beyond our control in one direction. Should we either embrace that? Should we continue to go along with that direction? Or should we say, oh, no, wait a second, that isn't what we intended, and let's go this other direction?